Now first, let's have a look at one or two definitions of the repository pattern. We'll break this down a little, and then I guess even more important is how would you actually write the code of such a repository pattern? So how would you develop this stuff? I will show you that, and make sure to stick around until the end, because then we will also talk about object relational mapping, which is often used in the combination of the repository pattern. So let's start. Here are the definitions in the Microsoft documentation. For instance, the repository is, or repositories are, classes or components that encapsulate the logic required to access data sources. All right, they centralize common data access functionality, providing better maintainability and decoupling the infrastructure or technology used to access databases from the domain model layer. So it is in essence, well, a class. By the example I will show you in a minute, a C# class. I also like to call this a service. And this service, then, it has some logic in it, or it accesses something else to, well, get the data from a database, for instance. And that's where object relational mapping comes in, with the example of Entity Framework, for instance, because Entity Framework itself also uses the repository pattern. And to be able to use these functions, then you would use a link to, for instance, access data from a specific table. Now, another definition is by Martin Fowler here in the book Patterns of Enterprise Application Architecture. So this guy really knows what he's talking about. He says a repository performs the tasks of an intermediary. This is quite interesting, I think, between the domain model layer and the data mapping, acting in a similar way to a set of domain objects in memory. Client objects declaratively build queries and send them, this is important, build queries and send them to the repositories for answers. So this, again, we will see this in a minute. This means a controller, for instance, a web API controller, we're talking .NET here, can use a repository, well, to get some answers, right? Conceptually, a repository encapsulates, that's the same as here above, a set of objects stored in the database and operations that can be performed on them, providing a way that is closer to the persistence layer, meaning you can use a repository to get the persisted data from a database, and you do not have to make the actual work to get the data from the database yourself. Repositories also support the purpose of separating clearly in one direction the dependency between the work domain and the data allocation or mapping. Now, dependency is also a great term here because we are actually using dependency injection together with the repositories. And now let's do the code, right? So in here, I just opened the default application of a web API project in Visual Studio 2022. Version here is now 17.4.0, and we're using .NET 7 here, all right? And in this example project, you can see already the following. We have the weather forecast controller. So I hope you're a bit familiar with web APIs or web services in general. What do we have here? We have the weather forecast class. This is just a certain model here in essence, and this controller thingy here is in essence the endpoint. Any client can access or can send some data to this endpoint or receive something from this endpoint here. We have this single function here, and we will use this example now. Again, this is just a controller, and this controller now randomly generates weather forecasts. When we run this, then Swagger UI will open and we will get these randomly generated weather forecasts. Now, as you can see here, there's our function. We can try this out, hit execute, and here's the result. All right, so we already get the data here. Now, imagine we want this data from a database, and imagine you would need this data again on another place. You want to write another controller, and again you need this data. Well, then again you would have to write this certain function here that is either accessing the database and returning the data from there, or even if you just want to use this thing here, you want random weather forecasts, then you would have to write another controller and again use the same function, use the same code. This sucks, right? So the magic word now is a repository. Now, when I do this, usually I just call these things services, and I know that lots of other developers do this as well. So let's say we've got a services folder here, and now we also create a new folder for weather forecast service, for instance. And in here now, to make this work, we need two things. We need an interface and we need an implementation class. So in here now, let's just create a new class for, actually I wanted to create an interface. Let's start with the interface, the weather forecast service interface, and then we create the corresponding implementation class here. So this then would simply be the weather forecast service, and this thing here of course uses the weather forecast service interface. All right, and now in the interface, let me have a look here. What is this function all about? So this is the name in this specific case, so maybe we can just use this, copy this here, and now we know we've got a function returning an I enumerable with of the type weather forecast, and this function is called get. We save this, and yes, we rebuild and apply the changes, although we've got now some build errors, of course, because we have to implement this function here in the implementation class. So in here now, we can actually press Control and period, implement the interface automatically. And now what we want to do is we simply grab this thing and put it here. All right. And with that, of course, we also need our summaries. So let me just remove them here actually. Put them here, and now we've got our repository in essence. All right, we have the interface defining the function, and then in here we've got the actual method. And now what we want to do here is we have to inject this service and then just use the method from the repository. So in here now we just say weather forecast service. This thing is called weather forecast service. Maybe we put this in a new line, and in here now we say create and assign the field weather forecast service, and we add the underscore here and here, and now we've got our repository injected with the help of dependency injection. And here now, instead of returning these lines of codes, in essence what we now do is we call our weather forecast service with the get function, and we're done. All right, so this is really what they meant in the definition, that we just want to get some answers from our repository. In this case here, our weather forecast service. You could also call this weather forecast repository, or when you wanted to inject this, maybe you already saw that in some repository, in some GitHub repositories, for instance, then it's not called weather forecast service, then it would be called weather forecast repo, for instance. Some devs do it like that. I usually call this stuff a service. It is a web service in essence, so that's what I do. And now the really nice thing is that we have no so-called fat controller anymore. The controller has not a lot of logic here. It just forwards the request from the client to the actual repository and then returns the actual data. All right. One more thing is missing here, but still, let's just run this one more time. And I hope that Swagger is opening. Yep, there it is. And now when we try this out, we get this error here. Unable to resolve service for type weather forecast service while attempting to activate the weather forecast controller. Now, what does this mean? This is more part of dependency injection here. We want to inject the forecast service, right? So we want to use the implementation class weather forecast service. But the thing is, where is this here? Where do we see actually that we want to use the weather forecast service, right? It is not here. It's not here, so the controller or the web API in general has no idea what is actually going on here. What do you want to do? What do you want from me, dear developer or dear user? So what we have to do is we have to tell the web API and the controller what implementation class to use. And for that, we go to our program CS and just register the service. And we do it like that, builder services, and then add either scoped, transient, or singleton. Several definitions, several functions here available for us. Most of the time you would use add scoped, and then here you just say weather forecast service. That's it actually. And then here also weather forecast service. That's it. Already added the reference here. Another option would be, since C#10, that we just add a global using directive here, but that's another topic. And now here with that, we tell our web API whenever something, for instance, the controller wants to inject the weather forecast service, then please use the weather forecast service implementation class. And the beautiful thing here is if you want to change something, play around with that, and you're not sure, can I actually change the code here? Not sure about that. Really don't want to touch it because it works. So what you can do instead is you go here, you just create another class and do it right here. Add a new class, weather forecast service. Let's say extended or version 2, whatever it is. Again, it uses the weather forecast service. We implement the interface, and now here, let's just say we grab the exact same code, but instead of, again, we need the summaries, maybe not the best example here. Maybe you could move that to another class, but stay with me here. I think to get the idea. Here, we just generate 5 examples. Now, what about 50? Not examples, results. So let's save this and this. Save everything here. And now pay attention. We've got our interface, right? This is a class that implements the interface. This is another class that implements the interface. But here in the program CS, we say we register it that way that we say, if you want to use this interface here, then please use this implementation class. Now let's run this one more time. And when Swagger UI is here, I have no idea if this is the correct version, we get these 5 results, right? And again, you wanted to play around with that stuff. So what now? If we want to just use the extended version, save that, try this out, hit execute. Maybe we have to run this one more time. And now let's see, it executes. Yep, now we get 50 results. You see the magic of this? Now we did not have to change the controller here. We just said, still, I want to use the weather forecast service here, and I just wanted to test something else here. I wanted to use another implementation. Now imagine you have 50 controllers, for instance, and every single controller uses the weather forecast service. Actually, a good example would be the logger, for instance, right? And every controller, you want to log something, but you want to change the behavior of the logger. Now imagine you would use fat controllers. You would have to change the behavior in 50 classes and 50 controllers. This is not happening here. You just make one change, either in the implementation class you already have, or you just use another one. You can just inherit from another class. And this is the only place where you have to change it. Here you say, instead of the weather forecast service, now I want to use the extended one, and it's done. And now regarding object relational mapping, Entity Framework uses the repository pattern in combination of the unit of work pattern. And if you first want to know what actually object relational mapping in general is, then just click on the video here on the screen.